Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 45, Intro to the Cedarling. And our guest today is me, Mike Schwartz. And our co-host today is Kevin Campman, an independent security and identity analyst. Welcome, Kevin. And maybe before we start, you could introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about how you got here.
Well, very good, Mike, and thank you for having me. I have quite a varied past, and so I started out in the printing industry way back when there was a printing industry, and transitioned to computer science because it was headed that way. I was one of Burton Group's. I worked for systems integrators for a while, but I was one of Burton Group's, which was an analyst firm you may know. I was one of their first consultants. And that's, interestingly enough, Gartner bought them. And after a while, I realized I'd been involved in those two companies for over 24 years. So that's basically where I come from. And I graduated from Gartner several years ago. I retired and became an independent consultant and analyst, and that's what I'm doing today, particularly around current topics in identity management. So you spend a lot of time dealing with organizations that are still trying to get their arms around what that is and how to keep up with the changes. Thank you.
Well, so thank you for volunteering today, Kevin. I don't know if people remember the Burton Group. It was like an embryonic time almost for the identity and access management sector, but it played a really important role at the time of coalescing standards like SAML and other really important conversations that there was really nowhere else to have them. It predates Internet Identity Workshop even. So
Right.
it was really pivotal. It was a catalyst at the time. And yeah, and so it's great. It's an honor to have you as co-host. As today, this is sort of a special episode because I talked to a lot of guests about what they're doing, and today I actually want to present something that Glue is working on. So that's why I'm the guest. Actually, I'm going to take my hat off because I'm switching roles. I'm not the host anymore. Now I'm the guest. And maybe I could start. We've been talking on the back channel on this topic, but maybe I could start by sharing a quick diagram and telling. So the topic is Cedar, and Glue has built a product called the Cedarling, which is a framework for authorization. And we've been developing this project for just about a year now. And let me try to share the first slide. This is always sort of risky for me. Here we go. So this is a slide that was it was a talk given by Amina Torlak from Amazon. She's really a scientist, and she was talking about the design of Cedar and how the Cedar policy language. I think everyone would their first question would be like, why do we need another policy language? And Cedar was sort of defined in this space where we have some very performant, easy to use syntaxes like RBAC, but they're not very expressive. And on the other side of that spectrum, we have some other languages, like I'm thinking about Rego, or that is used by OPA, Open Policy Agent, that are really, really expressive. But on the other hand, they're not deterministic, which means that they're more like full-on programming languages. And as Amazon might say more technically, they're not analyzable in a way that we know that they'll always, predictably return results. There could be an infinite loop, for example. You can't do a loop and know you'll get back a response. So Cedar was developed sort of to be more expressive while still being deterministic is how I always looked at it. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about, I'm still on a steep learning curve, my thought, but what were your thoughts after listening to the Amazon talk about the design of the language?
Well, I will say this: Amina is very expressive. in terms of how she is very, very excited about this. And they, you can tell that they did a very serious look at authorization and how to do it well. So what I like about Cedar is that they have bounded the edges of the product and made it, or of the line or the language, and made it very simple. So the concepts like RBAC and ABAC are in there. They serve a purpose. I would, but you can also look at the data and run that against you can test it to make sure that your data sets are useful and don't have a lot of particular of things that are out of scope or might cause errors. They, from a programming perspective, what I like is that they avoid black holes and things that you can get caught in. So, for example, they use, the language that goes along with this is Rust, and Rust doesn't deal with it doesn't allow you to make pointer errors. We all know about that, and it doesn't create repositories and so forth that can fail in the execution. So you can test the language. It's very easy to express yourself in. It protects you from the boundary conditions you might run into in an access solution, because we never can test for everything. They give you good test environments in which to make sure that for what this will work, and it'll prevent you from doing something that you didn't intend to come out as a result. So I think it's a nice evolution of authorization languages, and I like it's very easy to understand conceptually.
Yeah, and I think she said in that talk, and this talk is referenced in every episode has a wiki, and there's a wiki page with the links. Um, but she mentioned that they do something like 60 million. They use a fuzzing technique to generate data, and I think they run like 60 million tests a night against it to make sure there are none of these corner cases where the language might be non-deterministic, and they've identified some issues by doing that. Yeah, it's quite impressive. And I have to say, I was thoroughly discouraged from ever wanting to design my own policy language after listening to this talk.
Mm-hmm.
um, Let me show you. Actually said something interesting. You mentioned, okay, now I'm going to try for slide number 2. You mentioned that Cedar is a combination of RBAC and ABAC, and I think that's a really interesting point. So you're old enough to remember LDAP, and a lot of Cedar reminds me of LDAP a little bit, because the reason LDAP is fast is because in a tree structure you're able to look at a small subset of the data, and she calls that slicing. So
Mm-hmm.
because we're able to limit the scope of like the data that we're searching, our search is faster. And what I really found fascinating about Cedar is that they're using RBAC as a way to slice the data. And then they're using ABAC after that. And ABAC is slower because in ABAC, you have to look at every entry to see if it meets the criteria. So this seemed like a very powerful idea to me, that we would use the RBAC first, and if you can express all your policies there, you might not even need an ABAC part, but then
Right.
use ABAC on top of that to get a further granularity to create a more performant type of syntax.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought this was really a fascinating like innovation that they came up with.
Right. It really, the thing I like about the RBAC is that it points out the object and and whoever is acting on the object, right? And what that action is. So that conforms to the RBAC model, which unfortunately is fairly static. But membership occurs both with the resources and with the principles, and the action is what you're capable of doing based on your membership and what the object is able to accept. Now you can refine that with the ABAC rules. In other words, you're taking the role and you're assigning conditional, or you're refining that information, right? So you can test it to make it more granular, and all of that can be well defined.
Yeah, and they have a number of constructs. The in construct to say user or role in group or in role, and they allow you to define a number of different hierarchical structures. And so the RBAC part of it is quite expressive, and the ABAC part of it enables you to get even more granular. So yeah, we've been surprised at how powerful the policies that you can define in this combined syntax are. And let me move on to the next slide.
Before you do, this was
Yeah.
something I picked up. That one of the edge cases I picked up is it uses integer values. It doesn't use floating point.
Yeah.
So you can't have a conditional like pi. Uh, you have to have something that is either yes or no, and that's very consistent in this language. Thank you.
I actually got an insight into floating point numbers as a result of that conversation. There's a note in one of the FAQs that says, "Why don't we use floating point?" And it was something like zero point 0.1 plus zero point 0.2 equals zero point 0.3 returns false. It's because it's an infinite repeating number, and they want to make sure that anything that you can express in Cedar it actually comes back with a result, an expected result. So yeah, there's been a lot of analysis of those. So it is somewhat more constrained, so you have comparisons, you have decimal comparisons, but I think you can only do up to four decimal places, which should be enough for an authorization policy, I'd think. Um, but yeah, and so I encourage people. I joked with Kevin about how sometimes the footnotes tell you more about the design,
Mhm.
but that FAQ blog page I think gave me a lot of insights into what some of those edge cases were and why some of those subtle design decisions really in a way reflected a lot of nuance to me about Cedar. Um, so yeah, let's keep going. I have a record number of slides today. Normally I only do one or two slides, but today it's kind of conceptual. I want to talk about some of the other options out there. And I want to also make it clear that although Glue built a product around Cedar, we're not saying that other approaches to authorization aren't fantastic. And actually, I kind of see author PDPs, policy decision points, like databases. There's a lot of reasons why you might have a special purpose database. Time series databases. I thought every database we had was invented, and then a whole new sector of databases that do just time series like queries came out. And so there's a lot of room for PDPs. But when Glue was building a product, we were looking for certain properties and we evaluated different PDP solutions. And we decided on Cedar. And the other ones that I think are important to understand here are Rego, because OPA is the most widely deployed PDP in the cloud space. Graph databases, there's a number of Zanzibar-like implementations out there that use various graph strategies for authorization. And then finally, we have to list RBAC there. RBAC and passwords are kind of like the same, like the deployability and the usability for developers is good, but there are some real limitations. But I think RBAC is really important because that is probably 90% or more of the existing applications. So why? Let me explain the X's here because these are somewhat opinionated, and I just want to say why I have these X's. So the reason why I say Rego is not safe is because of the looping problem. Anything that has looping can have an infinite loop, so you can't really guarantee that it'll always return a result quickly. So it's not safe in that sense. And it's basically a property because Rego went for maximum expressibility. They had to sacrifice this safe quality. And then this edge one is really interesting. So one of our goals was to be able to embed the PDP in the web browser, a mobile app. And so the reason why I say a graph database is not edge is it's hypothetically possible. You could do it for sure. But most of the graph-based implementations use some type of database. And I would say that the graph model has been really great for cloud applications, like file sharing is sort of the poster child for graph authorization, something like a Google Documents like file sharing. And so it's not that you can't deploy a graph PDP in a browser or mobile app. It's just that no one's actually done it because I don't think the use case is really there. But for us, this was sort of important. And then ergonomic syntax. This is a really fancy way to say, is it developer friendly? And I gave Rego a no here. It's Lisp-like syntax, functional syntax is foreign to a lot of developers. And there's a fair number of developers who just flat out say they want something other than Rego. And so while I know people love Rego, I'm going to say that I gave them an X here. This is completely arbitrary. Um, and then the graph-based syntax, I don't know if you've ever looked at, one of the goals of Cedar was to be human readable so that an auditor, just a normal person could read it. And all of the graph syntax that I've seen, while the tools themselves can be really easy to understand, the underlying policy data sometimes is in JSON or triples or something, and the underlying policies can be quite hard to read. And then weirdly, RBAC ticks all these boxes. It's safe, it's edge, it's ergonomic syntax. What RBAC doesn't get is expressive. It's extremely limited in the types of policies, and it happens to be particularly bad for work group policy or force, or not workforce, workload. So what we might call machine to machine, or in OAuth jargon, we call software clients. But this workload security challenge is really becoming important to enterprises. We've had a number of episodes on this, and RBAC is particularly badly suited for workload security because, I mean, workloads aren't people, they aren't in groups, they don't have roles, and it's just a bad match. But anyway, that was a long, sort of a long digression on why Cedar versus other. Any thoughts on that, Kevin, or before?
Well, I wrote a lot about RBAC when I was at Gartner and Burton Group, and it's not an easy thing. It's great conceptually, but it's much more difficult to realize in practice. And one of the things that Cedar, again, making sure that there is a good set of data to begin with. They don't allow lists, right? Because lists have duplicates. And so you can create a set so that whatever's in that set can be operated on. And you can use you can use prior knowledge. In other words, you can create a query against a database that pulls uniques instead of creating that list with duplicates in it. So that's another boundary condition that they've eliminated by preventing you from corrupting your who's in a role, for example. So that's another protection for a developer to make it more reliable. And I think reliable and simple are also important when you start to deploy this in practice, because you might be running thousands of transactions a second, and you need to understand where the data is coming from, how good the data is, and so forth. And we know that data never lives up to our expectations. So
Yeah. I have Sean McKinney from Simus coming on in a couple of weeks, and he's written an RBAC tool called Fortress. It's in the Apache Foundation. And something that he always says that I remember is that RBAC is one of the only deterministic ANSI certified um, policy languages, which means we always know at a certain time, did you have access to this thing? And so I like CEDAR is a superset of RBAC in a way, in that it provides RBAC plus ABAC. And so that
Mm.
RBAC, you can still express those RBAC policies and they're still performant and they're still useful because we have a mechanism to govern those RBAC rules. So all of your SailPoint, deployments are still useful. So that's a good common denominator of policies that we're going to have, but we need something extra that can express those policies that we can't really express in RBAC. Like, for example, you need to use a hardware bound security token in order to maybe do a wire transfer or something. Like, there's just no good way to express that as a rule. So I think, yeah, we want to build on RBAC, not replace RBAC. But
Mhm.
I don't want to say that I don't think RBAC is not still super important, because we have all this policy and procedure for how to manage RBAC. Um, we want to build on top of that, and on something that's also as reliable and deterministic as RBAC.
Yeah, we don't want to deep end on that, but there are those, as I say, the proof is in the use of it, and so it relies on uh, good management of the information to be effective, and that's something that may or may not be under your control. So you have to understand where its limits are as you deploy it. But I do like
Yeah,
the idea of the in operator in terms of membership. Are you in this? Are you in this set or not? And and how the set is created, different question. But uh, if you can express that, you should be able to understand how to operate on it, right?
yeah. Well, let's move on. This has been a bunch of theory just on Cedar. Let's actually go into the Cedarling itself now and say, okay, so Amazon built this great. Um, let me go to full screen because this is a big diagram. So Amazon built this great Cedar engine, um, and which we use. You mentioned it's built in Rust. By
Mhm.
the way, there are actually other implementations of this. Rust is the reference implementation, and it's the most forward one. However, there's actually a Go implementation, and there might be some other ones. I know for sure there's a Go implementation. Um, but what we liked about Rust ourselves is that Rust has this special property of memory safety, where you get some of the performance benefits of C, but with more memory safety issues of something like a container.
Mhm.
So that for us was very attractive. But the main thing that was really attractive about Rust was that we could build a Rust core and then build different sort of wrapper applications or wrapper frameworks. So we could take our Cedarling software and build an iOS version, an Android version, a cloud version, a WebAssembly version that would run in the browser. So if we had to maintain different versions of this software um, for each distribution, inevitably one would get ahead of the others, and we'd basically always be chasing, like updating. Make sure you get the iOS, for the latest changes. It would drive us crazy, basically. So we like Rust in a way because it gives us a way to directly leverage the most advanced Amazon Cedar engine, to take advantage of the speed of Rust, because this thing has to be really fast. If it's running in the browser, it needs to be really fast and really small, and yeah, multi-platform. So what does the Cedarling do? Well, the Rust engine is great, but most for our customers, enterprise customers, the what we want to make it easier for is for developers to say, I have these tokens. Should I be able to do this action on this resource given this context? So the interesting thing is that the tokens themselves are the input or provide the principles. So for
Yes.
example, the ID token tells you who the person is and the details of the authentication event. What type of authenticator did they use to authenticate? When did they authenticate? The access token tells you what software was acting on behalf of this person. So was it a website? Was it a mobile application? Is it some back end process? So identifying the software or the workload, as we now say, is just as important as identifying the person, because we might want to make policies about the software. If I'm writing a mobile banking app, I might want a policy that says no piece of software other than my mobile banking app can call this, get deposit API or something. So the software identity and the person identity is important. And so what the Cedarling does is it takes those tokens, it maps them to entities, a person entity, a client entity, ID token entity, an access token entity, and enables you to quickly make policies about um, um, based on those tokens. Um, and Let me say just two other things about the Cedarling is that, okay, so it's evaluating your authorization policies, which you've defined, but it does two other important things. One is it validates the tokens, and the other is it logs. And sometimes logging is just as important as authorization, because we might have an application that actually can't use a PDP because it was written 15 years ago and we're afraid to touch it. So we might be afraid to completely rework the authorization, logic of an existing application, but adding in an additional audit log so we can say, here's the policy we would have run, that we would have expressed. The application doesn't actually use that policy, but at least we have a record in our standard format of what type of authorization decision was requested. So I think the ability to create an audit log and evaluate against policies is an underappreciated feature. But Cedarling, I guess to summarize, lets developers easily deploy Cedar in their applications and do things that are outside the scope of Cedar, like instantiating the entities, logging, and also validating the tokens. But does that make sense? Like, why do we need the Cedarling if Amazon already writes the Cedar engine? That's what I'm hoping people understand.
Makes sense. It does, because again, the thought that goes through my mind as I hear this is you objectify all these things, so they become deterministic in terms of, yes, I authenticated using a token. Yes, I'm coming in through my iOS application, and here is where that's coming from. So you can do very consistent validation of the context. And I think that's very important, is to know where this is happening and how it's happening. And applications weren't written for that. So if you can do that, if you can externalize that, that's very powerful.
Yeah, and let me show this. This diagram is going to be hard for people to read. Let me go to this diagram and just show that, for us, we wanted to see this Cedarling run across all applications in the stack. So the web browser is still really important. I think people forget, how much stuff actually still happens on the web. So the Cedarling compiles to WebAssembly, which people might not be that familiar with, but 93% of the browsers support it. And it enables you to write sort of safer plugins that can run directly in your application. So for example, the WebAssembly component could run in a React application. And a lot of the applications today are actually, it's a lot of business logic is actually happening in the browser itself. And so the Cedarling runs locally in the React or Angular or Vue application. So the developer can make a local call to the Cedarlings and say, I have these tokens. Should I display this button to allow the person to send a wire transfer? Or also, we want to move the authentication logic closer to the user. So if I want to require one of these hardware device constrained credentials like a YubiKey, then I'm better off taking care of that in the browser rather than authenticating the user, sending up an assertion to the cloud, getting some error message back that says, no, that's not good enough. So the closer we can build the security policies to the user, the better the user experience we can build. Mobile applications are also really important. Um, so mobile banking is one of our main targets, helping banks build more secure banking applications. But then running in the cloud, a number of vendors are really focusing on cloud and cloud native security. So we can use the Cedarling can run as a cloud function or potentially as a sidecar, although it's more lightweight to run it as a cloud function, like a Lambda function or something like that. So it is very cloud friendly also. In fact, there's a whole movement of deploying WASM in the cloud, although we don't use the WASM component in the cloud, we use a different component. But the idea here is that we can use this. We're not saying we want to rely on the front end solely for security, where this is zero trust. What we want to do actually is build a security at all the layers. We want to build it in the app. We want to build it in the API gateway. We want to build it in the backend services to have a multi-layer, i.e. zero trust architecture. But we really do want it in the front end. I think that's the part that, to me, I have this weird deja vu feeling where I feel like I invented the ultimate SiteMinder agent, because we've been very server oriented, but this agent really lives in the application. And it's not just the PEP, it's the PDP that's actually running in the application.
Right.
But I don't know, have you seen anything like this? Um, um, Maybe I'm overly enthusiastic about this idea of end to end.
Well, I haven't, to be honest, I haven't looked for it, but it makes sense to do it as close to the event as possible, right? Because then you don't build up that cascading set of dependencies. It's either there or it's not. Again, that's one of the principles of this, is it's either there or it's not. And so do these things, it's very explicit. And as you pass through the layers, each one does its own function, and you have that degree of assurance, right? That this isn't something that you've left something unexamined, right?
And also we have a consistent audit log, so we can create a chain of custody from the application to the. And I think I have another slide. We're burning through the slides here. Let me see if I can find this slide, which provides really a picture. I think this is a useful picture, and it will help me relate it back also to mobile security. But the idea here is that let's just take the example of a mobile app, and we download that mobile app from the App Store, and that mobile app performs dynamic client registration. So in our view of the world at Glue, each instance of a mobile app has its own unique credentials. We don't put in shared credentials or recommend putting in shared credentials.
Right.
And because each mobile app has its own credentials, we can now do more advanced OAuth flows like Depop, because now we have a way to cryptographically identify the instance of the mobile app. The mobile app can then authenticate a person, hopefully using something like passkeys. And Glue supports this new auth challenge endpoint, which is first-party native authentication, which would enable you to use FIDO directly from the mobile app without having to use the browser. You get back a token. And here's what I sort of wanted to point out, which is that, when we were getting feedback for the Cedarling, one enterprise customer said, we don't need you to validate the JWT. But what I would argue, though, is that actually it's getting harder to validate JWTs, because there's a new feature called OAuth status list, which is sort of like certificate revocation, where we're able to say this token is no longer valid Um, and it fills a hole in JWTs where, remember, with if I had a smart card, something like this, if this smart card expires, there was a certificate revocation list where if I go to present it somewhere, they could say, no, sorry, your smart card's been revoked. We have a similar mechanism now for JWTs, to revoke JWTs, but it's more efficient. Instead of just posting a big list of like the ID numbers of the JWTs, we have this spec called status lists where we can use just one 32 byte and publish a lot of statuses for a lot of JWTs. So the point I'm getting at here is that it's actually getting harder to validate JWTs. And by having the Cedarling do the JWT validation, we can define more complex rules about which token should be trusted. The Cedarling can take care of getting updated keys from multiple issuers. And also, we can make policies about trust, in like which access tokens you trust, or which roles from which issuers you trust. Um, and we can handle these new specs, like things like status lists, to affect faster revocations. So I noticed that Gartner is sort of in love with CAPE, the continuous access evaluation protocol. But my thought is, well, great, you get the event, but now you can't revoke the tokens. So what do you do about it? You just watch as the hacker does everything until their tokens expire. So I think we need some of these sort of advanced features to affect more real-time policies and real-time transactions. And it's a big ask for the developers. But by using sort of this strategy, we can get what I call an end-to-end chain of custody from the time you downloaded the app till you registered your instance, till you associated a person with that, so you obtained a token, you presented that token to an API, you use that token in the mobile app to try and do 25 different things, maybe 24 of them failed. That information itself might be useful. So by having sort of an end-to-end view, we can create sort of a chain of custody from the time the person downloaded the app to the time they effected that wire transfer. And we can in real time revoke. So the Cedarling, I think, gives you some powerful capabilities without having to drag developers down into the weeds too much. So, um, and let me go to the next slide and talk about, and here I think we can talk about how this affects some of the various users, because this is a multi-sided market. Yeah, these are my Chat GPT drawings actually. So thank you, Chat GPT. Um, and but so in this market, it gets, I think, from a business perspective, sometimes we need to consider each of the viewpoints of these different actors. Um, and so I've been talking a lot about the developer perspective, because for us, if we can't get developers to adopt it, it never goes anywhere. So if the CISO recommends something and shows it to the developers, and the developers are like, oh, that sucks, well, then you're done. So we need the developer adoption. Um, and so that's really primary, but it's not like actually we can forget about these other guys. A lot of the business value is actually in the CISO and auditor, because from the company perspective, there need to be SOC compliant and ISO 27K compliant, and they get questions like, "Show us your policies," and then is your software actually using those policies? Show us the evidence.
Mhm.
So, weirdly, I think a lot of the business values up here, the developers want to build better applications. They also don't want to be bothered with like the minutia of OpenID and OAuth specs. Like they don't want to read like the new spec on OAuth token status lists or something. So, that's sort of my thought about developers, is that they want to build better applications. Fundamentally, that's their job. They don't want to be bothered about OAuth and OpenID stuff. They actually conflate ID tokens and access tokens in general. And then the last thing is that they want it to be free, because they want to write their programs without having to get a license. And the auditor, yeah.
I was going to say, and if you, because you have this collection of interdependent parties, if you follow the process the way it ought to work, the developer is well, actually, the end user is the last person in the and DevOps are the last people in the chain, but the architect and developers can express that policy first, so the developer doesn't have to figure out how to instantiate it. That can be that, and that follows through not only from a performance standpoint to the right to the end user through the operations organization, but the auditor has the benefit of actually looking at what you intended and how you demonstrate it, right? So I think there's a benefit there, and so it really closes the loop in terms of what's actually happening, and so that again that's beneficial from a business investment standpoint because it's easier to identify and maintain.
Yeah, yeah. I think for compliance is becoming like a part of the business. We use Secure Frame here for our SOC conformance, but everyone's got a Vanta or a Secure Frame or some type of platform where they're showing being able to produce evidence, and that's a significant burden to the business. I mean, everyone's worried about it and trying to improve their processes there. And then in terms of being able to actually mitigate an attack, you can't do that unless you have good information about what's happening. And
Mhm.
so I think in order to use some of these new AI and ML tools, we really need the data in order to see what's anomalous behavior. Um, and our this is this live stream is the target audience is identity architects.
Mhm.
Weirdly, I'm not sure that our concern. I think we're probably the least important of all the constituents here. The fact that we're happy and excited about this is sort of like an added bonus. But the DevOps guys can really change this too. Like if it's not deployability is really important. Um, and so I think having it has to be cloud friendly, and that there's really been a seismic shift, I think, from moving towards cloud computing. It's powerful, but it's also raised a lot of new security and workload issues. And so I think that it's important in a way that it never was in the past. And the end user just wants it to be, well, they don't know anything about it, but
Right.
basically they want it to be easy to use and safe and feel good about it. Um, but yeah, so that's
One of the overriding themes of this is confidence, right? It does what you expect it to do most of the time, right? And you can test against that. So you hit the nail on the head when you say the end user can feel safe and it trusts you trust the environment. And so I think that was one of the design goals of this is to express the safety and to express the confidence in what's happening because it's straightforward and easy to understand.
yeah, and it has to be fast because I know as an end user, I certainly don't want to wait for anything. And the authorization server, the PDP, might get hundreds of requests from an application. Should I display this button? Should I display that button? And actually, the Cedar engine can do hundreds of evaluations in less than 1 millisecond. So speed is really has a big impact. Um, but yeah, it's been really fun working on this new product. What we've been sort of going to talk to customers about it earlier than usual because we want to make sure we build the right product. But we think we have it tuned sort of correctly now. We're looking to release it MVP at the end of this month. If any customers out there are interested in helping us or want to kick the tires, just let me know. My glue hat on. This is all actually in the open source. Um, the monetization strategy for this, so of course, Glue's upstream open source project is at the Linux Foundation. It's called the Jansen Project. All of this work is being done in the Jansen Project. Um, in terms of commercialization, where we see a place to add value is in better reporting and analysis of the data that's coming out of the Cedarling, because now you have a Cedarling running in every browser and every mobile app, and each of those Cedarlings is making logs. and how do you centralize those logs and how do you report on those logs? Well, centralizing those logs, that's actually in the open source, but reporting on those logs is something that we're building in GlueFlex, which is our commercial offering. But like most of the other glue products, we're trying to thread the needle on how to give away a lot of the value to developers so that they can build cool things, but also building in some way that we can figure out how enterprises can use the tools that they need and to solve some of their problems, which the average domain isn't really facing, but large domains and large organizations, some of the challenges they face. So, well, we're right at the top of the hour, actually, or the podcast. Kevin, give you last thoughts. Any last thoughts before we break?
Well, I think the market continues to develop, and this makes it much more straightforward to address all of the incoming and outgoing interactions with these solutions. And so I think the simplicity and the ability to understand the policies and how they operate and to do it in a lightweight, to do it in a performant manner is the adoption is going to rely on that. So it's very good that you're following this trend and contributing to the market. Thank you, Mike.
And I see there was some chat. So I will get to the chat after the episode. I'll answer any questions on the chat. And so I want to thank the audience for being with us. And next week we're going to continue this very similar conversation. Omri Gazit, the founder and CEO of Acerto, will be on, and we're going to talk about multi-layer auth, so which is really part of this whole conversation. I think I mentioned before, you can't do authorization just in the front end. It's zero trust. We have to do it everywhere. Omri is great. Most people out there probably know him, and so that's the Cedarling. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, audience, and we'll see you next Tuesday.